I'm Annabelle Owen, 34, and I built my life quietly, no spotlight, just showing up when it mattered. For years, I was the one who stayed, caring for my grandfather through his final years while my brother collected praise from a distance. But when he told me I wasn't worthy of speaking at our grandfather's funeral, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed by someone you sacrificed everything for? If so, drop your story in the comments, you're not alone. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being pushed aside, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, betrayal, and quiet strength. What happened next caught everyone off guard. My name is Annabelle Owen, and if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you my family was close. Dysfunctional, maybe. A little uneven. But close. It took a funeral, my grandfather's funeral, to show me just how far the cracks had spread. Before I tell you what happened the day a four-star general walked into that church and sat down beside me, let me know in the comments if you've ever been pushed aside by your own family, and hit that like button if you were told to stay quiet while someone else took the credit. Growing up, I never thought much about favoritism. I knew my older brother Ryan was my dad's shadow, star athlete, Marine officer, promoted early, always sending home photos in full dress uniform. I was the artsy one, the quiet one. Good grades, reliable, but not flashy. I didn't mind, not really. Not until it started affecting how people treated me. My parents had 2 kids, but only ever bragged about one. We lived in Southern Virginia, just outside of Norfolk. Our family dinners were the kind of traditional, sit-down affairs where the conversation revolved around Ryan's latest accomplishment. Ryan just bought a house, Ryan's commanding a new unit now, Ryan's flying back for Christmas, if the weather holds. I could have gotten a new job, finished a degree, moved across the country, and it would have barely earned a nod. Sometimes it felt like I was just background noise in my own life. The only person who never made me feel invisible was my grandfather, Colonel John Owen, U.S. Army, retired. Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the kind of handshake that crushed your fingers even in his 70s. But he didn't lead with that. He was more interested in who you were than what your resume said. When I was little, he taught me how to fix a leaky faucet and iron a dress shirt properly, so you can tell the difference between a wrinkle and a standard. That was a joke, but I took it seriously. He used to say, knowing how to pay attention is a form of respect. Don't forget that. I didn't. When his health started to slip, first the knees, then the cancer, I rearranged my work schedule so I could take him to his appointments. My parents helped here and there, mostly when it was convenient. Ryan wasn't around. Too far, too busy, too important. Grandpa never complained. But I could tell the silence bothered him. The last time he got out of the hospital, I stayed with him for a week. He'd lost weight and was more tired than usual, but his voice was still sharp. One night, as I was refilling his med tray, he said, "You know, you've got more discipline than half the officers I trained." I smiled, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't smiling back. "You're the only one who shows up. That means something." Then he reached for my hand, his grip weaker than I remembered, and said, "Don't let anyone tell you you don't belong at my funeral. You hear me?" At the time, I thought it was just an odd thing to say. He wasn't dying. Not yet. We had time. But I nodded and I held on to those words. I didn't know I'd need them. Ryan and I weren't close. We used to be when we were kids. He taught me how to ride a bike. Once, in high school, he punched a guy for talking about me in the locker room. But something shifted after he joined the military. He came back with a sharper edge, more serious. Our conversations became infrequent and formal, like he was performing a role even with me. I figured it was the distance, the deployments, the pressure. I never blamed him for pulling away. I just hoped, eventually, we'd get back to who we were. That never happened. When Grandpa's diagnosis turned terminal, I was the one who stayed overnight in the hospital. I was the one who filled out his advance directives, who explained them to my parents when they didn't understand the language. I was the one who cleaned out his house, arranged hospice, coordinated with the VA, made sure he had the flag he wanted for his final resting place. I don't say this for credit. I say it because it's what happened. No one asked me to do those things. I just did them. Someone had to. I told Ryan what was going on. Texted him updates. Let him know when it was getting close. He responded with thanks or appreciate the update. Never called. Never asked if I needed anything. But I still kept him in the loop because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought he'd want the chance to say goodbye. He flew in 2 days before Grandpa passed. The first time I saw him at the house, he walked in wearing his dress blues, said he'd come straight from a retirement ceremony. Our mom greeted him like he'd returned from war. Dad clapped him on the back. I stood in the kitchen, invisible again. When he finally turned to me, he just said, "Hey, Annabelle. Thanks for holding down the fort." That was it. After Grandpa passed, we sat in the living room to talk about funeral arrangements. I had already spoken to the chaplain and the funeral home, confirmed the burial site at Arlington, and submitted the paperwork for full military honors. Ryan listened quietly, then cleared his throat and said, "I think I should be the one to speak at the service." I nodded, waiting for him to go on. He did. "I mean, I'm the ranking officer in the family. It makes sense. A military funeral should be handled with the right tone. We can't have mixed messages." Then he looked directly at me. "No offense, but I don't think you're the right person to deliver anything formal." I didn't respond right away. I wanted to think I misheard him. But my mother added, "Ryan's right. He knew what kind of legacy your grandfather wanted to leave behind. A strong one. Military. Respected." I stared at them both. Then at my father, who didn't say a word. And suddenly, I understood. They had already decided. My relationship with Grandpa, the years of caretaking, the quiet sacrifices, none of it mattered. In their eyes, I hadn't earned the right to speak. "You're not exactly qualified," Ryan added, as if reading my expression. "It's not personal." I remember nodding slowly, not because I agreed, but because I didn't trust myself to speak. I left the room a few minutes later and made a phone call. It wasn't to fight back. It wasn't to demand anything. I just wanted one person, one voice, to show up in that room and recognize what I had done. Not for attention. Not for applause. But because my grandfather had told me once, respect isn't inherited. It's demonstrated. And I had demonstrated it. Over and over again. What happened at the funeral was something I never could have predicted. But when that general walked into the church, straight-backed and quiet, and took a seat beside me, everything changed. Not just in the room, but in the story my family had been telling themselves for years. And that's when the silence started to say more than any eulogy ever could. When Grandpa's health started declining, it didn't happen all at once. It was subtle at first, forgetting where he put things, stumbling over words he used to recite from memory. He was still sharp in spirit, still full of quiet pride and dry humor, but his body was giving out faster than any of us expected. The doctors said it was a combination of his age, chemo side effects, and years of accumulated wear. He brushed it off. Spent years marching through jungles and deserts. He told me one morning while adjusting the elastic on his blood pressure cuff, "This is nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of the end, and I think we both knew it. I took a leave from work to move into his house. My manager wasn't thrilled, but I didn't ask for permission. I just said I'd take PTO and unpaid days if needed. I packed a few bags, filled a prescription folder, and started my new routine: morning meds, check-ins with hospice, keeping track of his appetite and pain levels, walking his dog, changing bed linens, monitoring for side effects, trying to keep him laughing. Even a little. No one really said thank you. My mom called once to check in, mostly to ask if the freezer was still stocked with the meals she'd dropped off a month earlier. My dad said, "Just let us know if you need anything," but when I asked him to pick up a new raised toilet seat from the VA center, he said he was too swamped and maybe I could get it delivered instead. My brother? He texted once during that first week, "Appreciate you handling this. Let me know if it gets too heavy." That was it. When Ryan finally did fly in, 2 weeks before Grandpa passed, he stayed for less than 48 hours. He arrived with a duffel bag and full uniform, even though he had no official obligations. I asked him why he brought the uniform. He shrugged and said, thought he'd want to see it one last time. He spent most of the visit on his phone or stepping outside to take calls. Didn't ask about the medication schedule, didn't sit through any of the harder nights when Grandpa couldn't keep food down. He did, however, make sure to get a few posed photos of himself sitting beside Grandpa's hospital bed. One hand resting on Grandpa's shoulder, the other clutching that framed photo of their shared service. Grandpa was mostly asleep, his eyelids fluttering with the fatigue that never seemed to let up. Ryan captioned the picture later on social media with, "3 generations of service. Honoring my hero." He left the next morning. When I walked into the living room after dropping him off at the airport, I saw the photo. He had left it sitting on the mantel, framed, angled carefully toward the room, like an exhibit. Grandpa looked like a ghost in the picture. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Something about it didn't sit right, but I couldn't name it yet. The next time we had a family dinner, a rare occasion we were all in the same room, Ryan brought it up. We were eating spaghetti and garlic bread like it was any other Tuesday night, and he launched into a story about his recent training rotation. "Grandpa would have loved it," he said, twirling his fork slowly. "Tactical drills, leadership rotations. Real stuff. Not just admin work." I nodded, not looking up. Then he turned to me and smiled. "Guess you probably wouldn't know how to speak at a military funeral, huh?" It was said like a joke, like a dig between siblings, but it landed wrong. My fork paused midair. No one laughed, not even him. But no one said anything either. I forced a smile and kept chewing. Later, I thought maybe I was being overly sensitive. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. Maybe I was tired. But that night I lay awake and I heard the line again, the way his voice lowered slightly, the way his eyes flicked to our parents as he said it. And I realized it wasn't a joke. It was positioning. He was already laying the groundwork, marking territory, claiming the story as his. The next few weeks were quiet. I stayed with Grandpa full-time. He slept more than he was awake. He started slurring words. He forgot what month it was. But on the better days, he still knew me. Still cracked jokes. Still held my hand with a strength that surprised me. Ryan called once more. Asked if I'd had time to collect Grandpa's medals for the display case. I said I had. Then he started listing off the ones he thought should be included. Bronze Star, Purple Hearts, a campaign ribbon from Korea he thought was in the attic. I listened quietly. "Just want to make sure it's done right," he said. "You know, not just a bunch of photos and flowers." I didn't say anything. He continued, "I mean, people are going to expect a real military presence at the funeral. Grandpa earned that. He also earned not being turned into a symbol," I said, before I could stop myself. There was a pause on the line. "Then, what's that supposed to mean?" I said I had to go. The nurse had just arrived. That was a lie. I just couldn't hear his voice anymore. When I hung up, I stood by the kitchen sink and tried to breathe. It wasn't that I disagreed with honoring Grandpa's military service. Of course not. But Ryan was turning it into a brand. Into an image. And that image didn't have room for me. That became clearer at the next family gathering. Ryan had emailed an early draft of the funeral program, unprompted. He had formatted it like a formal ceremony. American flag watermark. Bold serif font. List of speakers: Chaplain Matthews, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Owen, retired. No mention of anyone else. When I asked if there was going to be an open reflection portion for the rest of the family, he looked confused. "Well," he said, "I figured it'd be more cohesive this way. Don't want it to run long. We only have the space for 90 minutes. Mom chimed in, "Ryan's just trying to make sure it's respectful." I said nothing, because at that point, what was there to say? I sat in silence as they discussed the color of the flower arrangements, the placement of the flag, whether the honor guard should fire 3 rounds or 5. Ryan spoke with certainty. My parents nodded like he was the only one who had ever worn a uniform, even though Grandpa used to say I was the only one in the family who actually listened to his war stories without interrupting. The moment that cemented everything came a few days later, during a phone call between my mom and me. I had just gotten back from another overnight at the hospice center. I told her Grandpa had asked about Ryan. She paused. "He really looks up to your brother." I didn't say anything. Then she added, "It's nice to know someone's carrying on the legacy." The words landed like a weight on my chest. Not because I needed recognition, but because they were rewriting the story in real time and I was being erased from it. I had been there for every appointment, every emergency call, every moment of clarity and confusion. And still, somehow, I wasn't part of the legacy. Just the footnote in someone else's chapter. It was in that moment, holding the phone to my ear, listening to my mother's voice fade into casual commentary about the eulogy, that I finally understood. They had already decided who the story belonged to. And it wasn't me. 2 days after Grandpa died, my phone rang at exactly 6 p.m. It was a group call, my mom, Dad, and Ryan. The tone was set before a single word was spoken. No one asked how I was doing. No one mentioned that I'd been the one holding his hand when he took his last breath. My mom opened with, "We thought it would be best to coordinate funeral details as a family." But it didn't feel like coordination. It felt like a formality. A decision already made, being delivered under the illusion of discussion. Ryan took over, like always. His voice was even rehearsed. "I'll be handling the eulogy. The military rep has confirmed my speaking slot, and I've drafted remarks that cover his service record, family life, and core values. If there's anything specific you think should be included, you can email it to me." I waited for the part where he said we could all share something. I waited for him to mention Grandpa's storytelling, his Sunday crossword habit, the time he built me a dollhouse from scratch because I hated the plastic ones. But that part never came. "Only you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He didn't hesitate. "It makes the most sense." "Why?" There was a pause. Then he said it. "Because you're not exactly qualified to speak on behalf of someone like Grandpa." I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I looked down at the table in front of me, at the folder of discharge papers, medical directives, and VA forms I'd filled out myself. I thought about the nights I sat beside Grandpa's bed when he cried out from phantom pain in his amputated leg. The time I spoon-fed him soup he couldn't hold down. The day he forgot who I was and then wept when he remembered. "You think I'm not qualified," I repeated. "This is about honor," Ryan said. "About representing him properly." You wouldn't get it. It wasn't even anger that came first. It was disbelief. Cold, blank disbelief. I tried to form a sentence, any sentence, but before I could, my mother jumped in. "Let's not make this about ego, Annabelle. This is a difficult time. Everyone's grieving." Grieving wasn't the word for what I felt. It was something sharper. A kind of grief that didn't come from loss, but from being cut out of the story entirely. Not just as a speaker, but as someone who mattered to him. To them. I looked at the phone. I listened to them continue, talking logistics, time slots, seating charts, floral arrangements. My name wasn't mentioned again. And in that silence, something snapped. Not loudly, not all at once. But quietly, a small shift I felt in my chest, like a wire pulled too tight finally giving way. I didn't say goodbye. I just hung up. Then I stared at the screen for a long time. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe a call back. Maybe someone to realize what had just happened. But the phone stayed silent. The silence was its own kind of message. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and filled the kettle. The act of boiling water felt grounding, mechanical. I didn't want to cry. I didn't even want to scream. I wanted to disappear. Because that's what they'd already done to me. Made me disappear. Rewritten history as if I hadn't been there. As if I hadn't shown up for Grandpa in the ways that actually mattered. The kettle clicked off. I didn't touch it. Instead, I walked to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a business card. Cream-colored, thick paper stock. No title. Just a name, General Matthew K. Wexler, Rett, and a number underneath. Grandpa had given it to me 2 years ago after a VA benefit meeting where General Wexler had shown up to advocate for better end-of-life resources. He was retired now, a man with quiet authority and an odd fondness for lemon tea. I'd seen him a few times. Once he brought Grandpa a signed photo from their unit reunion, even though Grandpa hadn't been able to attend. Another time, he came to the house and stayed for an hour. They'd barely spoken, but the silence between them was comfortable, familiar, respectful. I stared at the card. Then I dialed. His assistant answered. I explained who I was, that I was calling about John Owen. She put me on hold, and less than a minute later, I heard his voice. "Annabelle," he said. "Not Ms. Owen. Not, who is this? Just my name." He remembered. "I'm sorry to call like this," I said. I didn't know who else to." I heard he passed, he said gently. "I'm very sorry." "Thank you." I didn't know how to start. So I just said it. "My brother's giving the only eulogy." There was a pause. "And," he said. "And, they told me I'm not qualified to speak." He didn't say anything for a long time. "Then, do you want to speak?" "Yes," I said, before I could second-guess it. "But it's not about a speech. It's not even about me, really. It's just, they're pretending like I wasn't there." Another pause. "Then, I remember you at the house. You were always taking notes, making sure John didn't forget appointments. I remember thinking he trusted you." "He did," I said quietly. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Send me the details." I hesitated. "I'm not asking you to do anything." "I know you're not," he said. "But I'm going to show up anyway." I didn't cry until after the call ended. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off. I didn't write a eulogy. I didn't rehearse any speech. I just sat with the silence, the grief, the dull ache of being erased. And in that stillness, I promised myself one thing: I would show up. Even if it wasn't on the program. Even if they didn't acknowledge me. Even if all I did was sit in the front pew and hold my head high. I would not disappear. Because he had seen me. And now, someone else did too. The morning after the call with General Wexler, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relieved. I felt suspended. Like I was stuck in this strange, quiet space between what I had hoped would happen and what actually did. There was no fight, no dramatic confrontation. Just a phone call that lasted under 5 minutes and shifted everything. I hadn't told anyone about it. Not my parents. Not Ryan. I wasn't even sure I would. It felt too fragile. Too private. Like if I spoke it out loud, it might disappear. Instead, I went about the next few days doing what I always did, the logistics. I confirmed the burial plot with the cemetery office. I finalized the obituary draft I'd written 2 weeks earlier when Grandpa was still alive but fading. I coordinated transportation for 2 of his army buddies who were flying in from Texas. None of these tasks were asked of me. No one thanked me. But that wasn't why I was doing it. One night, I found myself organizing Grandpa's old records again. Discharge papers, service medals, citations. They'd all been tucked into a folder he kept in the bottom drawer of his dresser. The last time I had opened it, I was helping him apply for a benefit he didn't even want. "They make you jump through hoops for $100, he grumbled, but he still signed the forms because I'd taken the time to fill them out. As I flipped through the paperwork, I found a small index card in his handwriting, wedged between 2 yellowing letters from the VA. On it, he'd scribbled my name, just my name, and next to it, in all caps, "Trust with decisions if needed." It wasn't legally binding. It wasn't a formal directive. But I knew what it meant. I sat back on the floor and stared at it for a long time. I remembered every Sunday afternoon we spent watching old war documentaries. The way he'd pause the TV to tell me what really happened versus what Hollywood got wrong. I remembered the way he'd ask me to sit with him while he paid bills, not because he needed help, but because he liked the company. I remembered reading him letters from old army friends when his eyesight started to go, how he'd correct me on pronunciations even though he couldn't see the words himself. I hadn't just known him. I'd witnessed him. The daily, quiet version of him. Not the medals or the war stories or the parade appearances. The man who refused help but let me clean his coffee maker. The man who wouldn't take painkillers unless I was the one handing them to him. The man who once told me, if you want to know who someone really is, see how they act when they're tired. I didn't want to give a speech. I didn't care about the podium or the crowd or whether people clapped when my name was called. I just didn't want to disappear. That's what it had started to feel like, not just being sidelined, but being erased from his story. As if showing up every day, quietly, without applause, meant I hadn't been there at all. As if my absence from the program meant I'd never mattered in the first place. So I made a decision. I wouldn't fight Ryan over the eulogy. I wouldn't demand equal time or beg for acknowledgement. But I also wouldn't sit in the back and shrink myself to fit the space they allowed me. I would sit in the front row. I would wear the navy blazer Grandpa used to say made me look like a senator. I would hold his flag when they folded it. I would be there, fully, visibly, whether they liked it or not. And if anyone asked who I was, I'd tell them the truth. I was the one who stayed. I kept waiting for the call from my parents, the one where they'd realize how badly that family meeting had gone. But it never came. I got a few logistical texts from my mom. Service starts at 10:30 sharp. Please be on time. Reception at the church hall afterward. Nothing personal. Nothing warm. Just itinerary. It was probably easier for them to pretend things were fine. It always had been. The night before the funeral, I got a message from one of Grandpa's old neighbors, Mr. Kessler. He was in his 80s now, mostly homebound, but he'd known our family since I was in middle school. Your grandfather was proud of you, he wrote. He told me once that if anything ever happened, he knew you'd handle it. Said you had grit. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Thank you. I hope I live up to that. But what I really meant was, I hope someone else in that room sees it too. That night, I pulled out a small notebook and jotted down a few lines. Not a speech. Not a eulogy. Just things I didn't want to forget. The time Grandpa taught me how to shine shoes using a cotton rag and patience. The day he asked me to go through his safe deposit box with him so someone knows where the boring stuff is. The way he used to hum the army cadence under his breath when doing chores. I wrote them down not because I planned to read them out loud, but because I wanted a record, something that proved I had seen him fully. That I had loved him not for his rank or his medals, but for who he was in between. Before I went to bed, I laid out my clothes. The navy blazer, a black dress, low heels. Nothing flashy. Just enough to feel like I belonged at the front of the room. The program didn't have my name on it. But I was going to be there. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever looks Ryan gave me, whatever side comments my parents made, I was going to show up. Not out of spite. Not to make a point. Just because Grandpa would have wanted me there. And because for once, I wanted to take up space, without needing someone else to approve of it. The morning of the funeral, I arrived at the church 45 minutes early. The sanctuary was still mostly empty, just a few early arrivals murmuring to each other in low tones. The flower arrangements hadn't even been fully set out yet. I took a seat in the front row, second from the center aisle, and rested my hands on my lap. Calm. Composed. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just wanted to be where Grandpa would have seen me. I hadn't told anyone General Wexler was coming. Not Ryan. Not my parents. Not even the funeral coordinator. I didn't need permission to invite someone who had shared a deeper, longer friendship with my grandfather than anyone in that church probably realized. And I knew what his presence would mean. Not theatrics. Not disruption. Just visibility. Quiet, undeniable visibility. The sanctuary filled up slowly. Distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Old neighbors. A few men I recognized from the VFW hall. Some of Grandpa's army buddies from the retirement community shuffled in wearing medals pinned to their jackets and dress hats tucked respectfully under their arms. I caught sight of my parents entering from the back. My mom wore a tailored black dress with a silk scarf knotted at her throat. My dad was in a gray suit, already fussing with the buttons on his sleeves. They didn't see me at first. They hovered near the entryway, chatting with people they knew, accepting hugs, making solemn small talk. Then my mom's eyes scanned the front rows and locked on mine. Her mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't say anything. They took seats 2 rows behind me. Ryan arrived 10 minutes before the service began. Punctual, confident, and very much aware of his own image. He walked in wearing his formal Marine dress uniform, the one with the ribbons perfectly arranged and the polished shoes that echoed across the stone floor. People turned to look as he entered, which I'm sure was exactly what he wanted. He nodded at a few guests, clapped a hand on someone's shoulder, shook the pastor's hand like a visiting dignitary. When he saw me in the front row, his eyebrows raised just slightly. A flash of something, confusion, maybe irritation, passed across his face, but he didn't stop. He walked right past and took his place at the front near the pulpit, pulling a folded speech from the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't acknowledge me. The chaplain greeted the crowd. He gave a standard opening, comforting, respectful, warm. A hymn played. A cousin read a Bible verse. And then the chaplain announced that Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Owen would be offering the eulogy. Ryan stood, smoothed his jacket, and stepped toward the podium. That's when the doors at the back of the church opened. I didn't turn to look. I didn't need to. I heard it first, the quiet shift in the room, the subtle rustle of movement as people turned their heads, the small gasp from somewhere on the left side of the pews. Then the sound of heels clicking in precise rhythm against the stone floor. I felt him before I saw him. General Wexler walked down the center aisle with the kind of presence that didn't need introduction. Full dress uniform, for stars gleaming, posture straight despite his age. No entourage. No announcement. Just gravity. And recognition. He passed row after row without breaking stride and came to a stop beside my pew. I looked up at him. He met my eyes, nodded once, not formally, not ceremoniously, but with quiet recognition, and then sat down next to me. He didn't look at Ryan. He didn't have to. Ryan froze at the podium. For the first time since he walked in, he looked uncertain. His gaze flicked between me and the general. I saw the moment he understood. The color drained from his face. His hand, the one holding his speech, trembled slightly. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming to honor our grandfather, Colonel John Owen," he began. He was a patriot, a leader, and a man of deep integrity. His words sounded practiced, memorized, detached. He spoke in long, flowing sentences about valor and service, about duty and sacrifice. He recited Grandpa's deployments, his medals, his rank, his official commendations. It was polished. It was respectful. But it was empty. He never mentioned the way Grandpa fell asleep to radio baseball games because the announcers' voices reminded him of when he was stationed overseas. He didn't mention the coffee cup Grandpa refused to replace even though the handle had broken off. He didn't mention the photo in Grandpa's wallet, the one he carried for 40 years, of my grandmother laughing in the snow. He didn't mention anything that felt real. And people felt it. The room was still, but not in a reverent way. More like in a holding pattern. Waiting. Listening politely, but not connecting. When Ryan finished, he stepped back from the podium and gave a short nod. There was a light scattering of applause, the kind people offer more out of obligation than emotion. He returned to his seat across the aisle. The chaplain stood again. At this time, we will invite anyone who would like to share a memory of Colonel Owen to do so. Ryan stiffened. That part hadn't been in the program he'd circulated. He glanced toward the chaplain, who smiled gently and gestured toward the microphone. Silence. Then the sound of a chair sliding quietly back. General Wexler stood. He didn't need notes. He didn't need introduction. He stepped to the front of the room and waited for the space to still. Then he began. John Owen wasn't just a soldier, he said. He was a man who believed in showing up. He talked about their early days in training. How Grandpa once volunteered for an overnight guard rotation just so a young private could get a few extra hours of sleep. How he made a habit of checking in on the guys who never spoke up. How he once told a superior officer, if we're not looking out for the quiet ones, what are we even leading? He looked out across the room and said, I've met a lot of people who talk about leadership. Very few who practiced it when no one was watching. Then he paused. And from what I understand, he raised someone who inherited that same instinct. The room was silent. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. He stepped down from the podium without fanfare and returned to the seat beside me. When he sat, he placed one hand briefly on top of mine. A quiet gesture. A signal. I didn't cry, but I felt seen. Not in a public way. Not in a spotlight way. In a way that was just real. Ryan didn't speak again. He didn't come over after the service. He stayed near the back of the reception hall, surrounded by people asking about his uniform, his deployments, his rank. But no one asked him about Grandpa. They asked me. A woman I didn't recognize came up to me near the dessert table and said, I heard you were the one who took care of him near the end. He talked about you. Another man leaned in and said, "You're the granddaughter who stayed, right?" I just nodded. There was no confrontation. No dramatic reckoning. Just a quiet shift. And from that moment forward, they couldn't pretend I hadn't been part of the story. Because now everyone had seen it for themselves. For the rest of the service, my brother sat stone still in his seat. Not sulking, not glaring, just blank. Like someone realizing too late that the part he auditioned for had already been filled. The program continued as planned. But the mood in the room had shifted. Not because of anything dramatic. There was no confrontation, no storming out. Just a quiet realignment. A subtle pivot in where people were looking and who they were now listening to. The reception was held in the church hall just across the parking lot. Folding tables lined with finger foods, pots of coffee, and framed photos of Grandpa that Ryan had insisted we display. Most of them were from the military years. There was only one photo from after his retirement, a grainy candid of him sitting on the porch, looking off to the side, like he hadn't realized someone was taking the picture. I'd taken that photo. I remember the moment clearly. We'd just finished fixing the porch railing, and he was telling me a story about the time he almost got court-martialed for speaking up during a mission briefing. "Timing is everything," he'd said, grinning, before going quiet. That photo captured him better than all the formal portraits combined. People started to approach me during the reception, a slow trickle at first, then more. A few of Grandpa's old army friends introduced themselves. One of them, a man named Wallace, said, "He talked about you. Said you were the only one who knew how to get the damn VA to do anything useful." I smiled, surprised. "He said that?" Wallace nodded. "Said you filled out the forms before he even asked. Said you had follow-through, which, coming from him, was the highest compliment you could get." I thanked him, and he moved on. But that small exchange stayed with me. My parents hovered near the dessert table, greeting people as they came and went. My mom glanced over at me now and then, but never approached. My dad stayed focused on the coffee, refilling cups and avoiding conversation unless absolutely necessary. Neither of them mentioned the general. Neither asked why he'd sat beside me. It was as if pretending they hadn't noticed him was easier than facing what his presence had clarified. Ryan stayed near the back, surrounded by people who'd come to shake his hand, thank him for his service, ask about his latest posting. He played the part well, gracious, humble, even self-deprecating. But his eyes didn't light up. His posture had wilted, slightly. There was a stiffness in the way he held himself that hadn't been there before. At one point, I walked past him to get a glass of water. We made brief eye contact. He nodded once, tight-lipped, but didn't say anything. I didn't stop. I didn't owe him the first word. I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. That evening, after everyone had left, I stayed behind to help clean up. The church staff offered, but I waved them off. I wanted the quiet. The chance to reset. I moved between tables, gathering crumpled napkins and empty cups, slowly bringing order back to the space. I was halfway through stacking chairs when someone approached from behind. "I didn't expect him to come," Ryan said. I turned. He stood there, jacket folded over his arm, tie loosened. He looked smaller than he had that morning. Less polished. "I didn't think you'd want him there," I replied. He rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't. We stood in silence for a moment. "I'm guessing you invited him," he said. I nodded. "I called him after our family meeting." Ryan let out a short breath. Not angry, not surprised. Just quiet. He looked down at the floor. "He didn't even mention me," he said, more to himself than to me. I didn't respond. After a pause, he added, "His speech, yours, whatever that was, it landed." I didn't correct him. I hadn't spoken. I hadn't given a speech. But I'd been seen. Ryan looked up at me, something shifting behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or embarrassment. I didn't think it would matter. "You not speaking, I mean." "I know," I said. He nodded slowly. But it did. And that was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from him. After the funeral, things didn't go back to normal because there had never really been a normal to begin with. But the balance shifted. Quietly over time. Ryan didn't call me after the service. Neither did my parents. But word spread, from the general, from the people at the reception, from those who had seen what happened in that room. I started getting small notes from people who had known Grandpa through the VA, or the church, or old Army circles. Notes that said, "Thank you for being there for him," or "He spoke about you often." I even got a letter in the mail from one of his former lieutenants. Handwritten. 5 paragraphs long. At the bottom, he'd written, "You earned his trust." Not everyone did. That letter is still in my nightstand drawer. I didn't try to reach out to my family. I didn't try to smooth things over or pretend like the months leading up to the funeral hadn't happened. I needed the space. I needed time to remind myself that my worth wasn't tied to whether or not they acknowledged it. Instead, I focused on other things. I started volunteering at the local VA center on weekends. Nothing big, just helping new patients navigate the paperwork, making sure they understood their benefits, sitting with them when they didn't have anyone else to show up. It felt right. Familiar. At first, I didn't tell anyone. But one day, the director of the center asked if I'd consider running a small caregiver training series. Just a few evenings. Practical tips. Real talk. He said, "You've clearly been in it. You get it." So I said yes. I think that was when I started to feel something shift inside me. Not a reinvention, but a realignment. Like I'd found a place where the skills I'd used quietly, invisibly, for years, actually mattered. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from General Wexler. A simple white envelope with a military postmark. Inside was a typed note, "Annabelle, legacy isn't a story you inherit. It's the work you do when no one is watching. You honored your grandfather in ways that don't need ceremony. But I hope you know what you did mattered." To him. And to those of us who saw it. With respect, M.K. Wexler, I folded the letter carefully and slid it into the same drawer as the one from the lieutenant. And then I sat down at my desk and finally wrote my own words, not a eulogy, not a speech, but a record. Of the man who taught me how to pay attention. And of the quiet ways he showed up, even when no one noticed. It wasn't about closure. I don't think I believe in that anymore. It was about truth. And claiming my place in it. He left without saying a word. Not a nod, not a glance. Just disappeared into the crowd after the service, still in his uniform, shoes echoing against the church floor like punctuation. And just like that, he was gone. I wasn't surprised. The first message came exactly 8 days later. Mid-morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with the VA benefits form open in one tab and my email half-drafted when my phone buzzed. It was from Ryan. "I didn't know you'd done all that for him," it read. No greeting. No punctuation. Just that. I stared at it for a while, unsure what to do. There was no question mark. Nothing to answer. Just a sentence, flat, factual, and dropped into my inbox like a rock. I didn't reply. Not out of pettiness. I just didn't have anything to give him. Not yet. For years, he hadn't seen me. Not when I took time off work to shuttle Grandpa to the VA. Not when I spent evenings reviewing insurance documents he refused to look at. Not even when I slept on that couch for days when Grandpa was too weak to stand. And now, after all of it, after the funeral, the silence, the disappearance, he wanted a response. A summary. A shortcut. I closed the message and went back to my form. Weeks passed. Then months. My parents sent me a birthday card in June and signed, "Just love, Mom and Dad," pre-printed inside. A card like that doesn't really say, "I remembered you." It says, "I remembered to remember you." I stuck it in a drawer and didn't think about it again. In late August, Ryan texted again. "Back in town next week. Wanna grab coffee?" This time, I didn't ignore it. I typed, "Sure," and hit send. I wasn't interested in rehashing the funeral. I didn't need a formal apology with bullet points and accountability. I didn't expect him to hand me a ribbon and say I'd won. I just wanted to see if he was capable of showing up like a person, not a role. We met at a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral ground. I arrived first and took a seat outside. It was warm that day, sunlight bouncing off the glass, patio umbrella barely shading the table. I ordered a tea. When he showed up, he looked the same as always. Pressed shirt, haircut still regulation short, no visible sign that anything had changed. But when he sat down, he didn't jump into conversation. He didn't pull out his phone. He just sat there, a little awkward, a little quieter than I remembered. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes," he said eventually. I shrugged. "I almost didn't." He nodded. "Fair." We talked. Mostly small things. Work. Travel. The cafe's ridiculous parking situation. Every so often, he'd mention Grandpa, tentatively, like testing the weight of it. I didn't fill in gaps for him. I didn't volunteer stories he'd missed. I let the silence sit when it needed to. He didn't ask why I'd never told him what I was doing for Grandpa. I think he knew better than to put that on me. At one point, he said, "You were there for the hard stuff." I wasn't. That's on me. It wasn't a full apology, but it was more than I expected. Still, I didn't reach across the table. I didn't say it's okay. I just nodded. Because it wasn't okay. But it was something. When we finished our drinks, he offered to walk me to my car. I declined. We parted with a simple, "Take care." And that felt right. Since then, we've talked a handful of times. A text here, a forwarded article there. Nothing deep. Nothing forced. But I've kept the door open. Not wide. Just unlocked. That's the thing no one really tells you about rebuilding trust. It doesn't feel like a homecoming. It feels like construction. Like surveying damage, checking the foundation, asking yourself over and over, is this worth rebuilding? And if so, what kind of structure do I want this time? I don't want what we had before. I don't want performance or hierarchy or keeping score. I want eye-level connection. A shared understanding that whatever happens next, it has to be honest. And that kind of connection takes time. It also takes space. I still think about Grandpa a lot. Not in the dramatic, grief-soaked way I did those first few weeks. More like he shows up in the quiet. When I'm fixing something around the house. When I'm at the pharmacy and overhear someone asking how to read a prescription. When I pause to listen to an old baseball game on the radio just because the voices remind me of that final summer. There's a picture of him on my bookshelf now. Not one of the military ones. Just him in the backyard, holding a mug, smiling slightly, like he'd just told a joke to himself. That's the man I remember. Not the medals. Not the folded flag. Just him. Sometimes people ask if my brother and I ever made up. I don't have a clean answer. We didn't fight it out. We didn't hug it out. We just adjusted. Maybe that's the best you can hope for sometimes. Not resolution, but recalibration. I'm not keeping score anymore. I'm keeping boundaries. And if trust comes back, it'll do so on my terms. Slowly. Quietly. Like the kind of respect you don't demand, you earn. It's been a year. Not to the day, but close enough that the air feels familiar. Late fall, brittle wind, the kind of gray sky that makes you pull your coat a little tighter even if you're only going from the car to the door. A few weeks ago, I got a card in the mail. White envelope. Neat block lettering. Inside, a simple note on official stationery. From General Wexler. Still thinking of him. Still grateful for you. Hope you're well, Annabelle. There was no signature beyond that, just initials at the bottom and a PS. You ever change your mind about DC, let me know. I smiled when I read it. Not because I planned on taking him up on that old suggestion, the veterans liaison role he once floated half seriously after the funeral, but because I appreciated the gesture. The quiet continuation. A thread that never unraveled. Most things didn't stay that neat after Grandpa died. The day after the funeral, everything went still for a while. The logistics ended. The visitors stopped. The tasks ran out. And then came the real work, the kind with no forms to file or thank you notes to send. I kept volunteering at the VA center. Nothing big. Just small, consistent things. Printing handouts, walking first-time visitors through paperwork, sitting with families who weren't sure what came next. Eventually, I started helping with a new caregiver program, one that wasn't about giving speeches or writing manuals, but about listening. Asking the right questions. Being the person who didn't flinch when someone said, "I'm tired and I don't know if I can do this anymore." The first time someone cried in front of me, I didn't say anything profound. I just stayed. And that turned out to be enough. Sometimes people ask why I do it. I don't give them a long explanation. I don't tell them about the months I spent being invisible, or the way the general's hand on mine during the funeral felt like an anchor. I just say, it's meaningful to me. Because it is. I never wanted a spotlight. I didn't need applause or recognition or a seat at the podium. I just didn't want to be erased. And I wasn't. People remember more than we think. Not always loudly. Not always in the moment. But eventually, in the quiet ways that matter. A few months ago, I ran into someone from the funeral, a woman I hadn't seen since that day. She was leaving the VA building as I arrived. We recognized each other at the same time. "You're John Owen's granddaughter, right?" she said. "The one who sat with him near the end." I nodded. "He talked about you," she said. "Said you were the reason he got through the red tape. Called you his secret weapon." I laughed. "He actually said that?" She smiled. "More than once." I didn't know what to say. So I just thanked her and watched as she walked off into the parking lot. That's how it's been, quiet, subtle echoes. A name remembered. A story retold. A look of recognition from someone who hadn't said anything before. Ryan and I talk now and then. Nothing deep. Usually short texts. Holidays. The occasional article he thinks I'll like. We're not close, but we're not hostile. Just distant in the way people become when the scaffolding that once held up their dynamic is gone. He's moved back across the country. Took a new position. From what I can tell, he's doing fine. He doesn't bring up the funeral anymore. Neither do I. There's no rivalry now. No debate over who carries Grandpa's memory or who gets to speak for it. Because the truth is, no one owns a legacy. Not entirely. Some people inherit medals or stories. Others inherit trust. I got the latter. It didn't come with instructions. It didn't come with public recognition. It came with the way he looked at me when I handed him his morning coffee. The way he asked me to review his will. The way he'd say, "You're here," like it was the most reassuring thing in the world. I used to think legacy was something you built through titles or achievements, a speech, a plaque, a mention in a program. But now I know better. Legacy is what remains in the people who are actually paying attention. And I was. There's a photo on my dresser now. It's not a formal portrait. Just Grandpa in his backyard, holding that old mug, the one with the chipped rim. I keep it next to my keys. Not because I need a daily reminder, but because I like starting the day with him nearby. Every Veterans Day, I place a small flag beside his gravestone. I don't post about it. I don't take photos. I just go. Alone. Quietly. Sometimes I bring a thermos of coffee and sit for a while. Not because I'm hoping for a sign or some grand emotional release. Just because that's what we used to do. Sit. Talk. Or not talk. One time, a few months back, I ran into Wallace, one of Grandpa's Army friends, outside the VA center. He looked older, a little slower, but he still remembered me. He said, "Your grandpa used to say, she doesn't flinch. That's what makes her different." I didn't know he said that. I just nodded. That's the part that stayed with me. Not the compliment, though it meant something, but the fact that even when I wasn't trying to be seen, someone had noticed. And maybe that's all I ever really wanted. Not a spotlight. Not a microphone. Just a matter in the story. To be counted. To be remembered not for what I said, but for what I did. And in that, I was never erased. I was present. I was trusted. And I showed up. Thanks for watching. Have you ever been cut out of something that should have been yours to share, just because someone else thought they knew better? Or had to find your own way to be heard without saying a word? Drop your story in the comments. I read every one. And if this reminded you of someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories about quiet strength and taking back your voice.